Have you ever felt like you were rowing against a storm that just wouldn't end? Like no matter how hard you try, the waves only seem to get bigger? What if I told you the answer isn't to row harder, but to trust more? This is the story of a mother who, in the middle of chaos, discovered that peace doesn't come when the storm disappears. It comes when your heart learns to trust, even in the middle of the waves. Stay with me until the end, because what happened to her might change how you face your own storms. It was a late afternoon like any other at Emma's house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft golden hues while her children laughed and played in the backyard. The dog spun in circles, chasing an old toy, and Emma leaned against the fence, watching it all with a faint smile. For a brief moment, everything felt like it was exactly where it needed to be. Life has a strange way of giving us this false sense of control. Quiet moments that trick us into believing the horizon will always stay clear. Then the phone rang. Emma hesitated for a second, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She almost let the call go to voicemail, but something told her to pick up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was serious and sharp. "Emma, we need to talk. Something important is happening." In seconds, the sunny backyard, filled with laughter, felt distant. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the weight of that phone call had crossed the line and settled on her shoulders. Emma hung up slowly, standing still and staring at nothing. The sound of the kids playing outside still echoed, but something inside her had shifted. It was subtle but undeniable, a sinking feeling that things wouldn't stay simple from now on. Sometimes storms arrive like this, without dark clouds in the sky or thunder to warn you. They come in the form of words, glances, or, in Emma's case, a phone call. She tried to brush it off, turning her eyes back to her children. They kept playing, unaware of the storm that had already started forming in their mother's heart. Emma knew she had to stay strong. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, one thought kept circling in her mind. Am I going to get through this? That week, everything seemed to fall apart all at once. What started with one phone call quickly unraveled into 1,000 little battles Emma had to fight every day. On Monday morning, the email confirmed the rumors. The company Emma worked for was downsizing. She wasn't let go, but her hours were cut drastically. "Don't worry, Emma. We're just adjusting things for now," her boss said. But Emma knew what that meant. It was only a matter of time. By Wednesday, Ben, her youngest, woke up with a fever. The thermometer read 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and like any mother, Emma dropped everything to care for him. But that meant missing work, something she knew wouldn't look good during layoffs. While Ben slept on the couch, her phone rang again. The electricity bill was overdue. The voice on the other end warned her that the final payment date was approaching. On Friday, the car made that noise again, a grinding sound every time she turned the key. Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, hoping it would stop on its own. "Not now, please, not now." The feeling of drowning was inevitable. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at the growing stack of bills. It felt like the water was rising little by little, forcing her to row harder. But no matter what she did, she wasn't getting anywhere. "How am I going to pay for all this?" she thought, resting her head in her hands. It was the first time Emma truly felt fear wrapping around her throat, tight and suffocating. Her mind drifted to a story she hadn't thought of in years. Peter, rowing against the wind, while the waves threatened to overturn his boat. But in that story, Jesus walked toward Peter on the water. Tonight, Emma didn't see anyone walking toward her. The kitchen felt heavy, the silence broken only by the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. And for the first time in a long while, Emma wondered, am I going to make it? That night, sleep never came. Emma tossed and turned in bed, listening to the soft patter of rain against the window. The house was wrapped in darkness, but her mind was anything but quiet. a storm of thoughts swirling relentlessly. The bedroom felt too small, the air too heavy. So she got up. Emma tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake the kids, and made her way to the kitchen. The clock on the wall read 2:43 a.m. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, the only sound keeping her company. She poured herself a cup of tea, though she wasn't really thirsty. The warmth of the mug in her hands felt grounding, something to hold on to, even if only for a moment. But as Emma leaned against the counter, her gaze drifted toward the table. The bills were still there. Ben lay curled up on the couch, his little chest rising and falling peacefully. The weight in Emma's chest grew heavier. Before she knew it, the tears began to fall. She slid down to the floor, placing the mug aside, and rested her head against the cabinets. God, I don't know what else to do. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She wasn't even sure why she prayed. Maybe because when everything falls apart, the heart cries out, even if it's nothing more than a quiet plea in the middle of the night. Emma didn't ask for miracles or answers. She just wanted to keep going. I just need enough strength for one more day. As she sat there, something shifted. There was no booming voice or flash of light, but Emma felt it, subtle and almost imperceptible. It wasn't relief, but it was something, like the presence of someone sitting beside her in silence, sharing a burden no one else could see. The peace didn't rush in. It came gently, like a breath of wind sneaking through a closed window. Emma leaned back, feeling the coolness of the floor beneath her legs. The exhaustion was still there. The bills hadn't disappeared, but the weight pressing against her heart seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in weeks, Emma closed her eyes and rested, even if only for a few hours. The house was still quiet when Emma came downstairs. The sun was just starting to peek through the windows, casting soft golden light across the wooden floor. The smell of coffee filled the air, but Emma barely tasted it as she took slow sips, lost in thought. Last night felt like a blur. She remembered the quiet tears, the cold kitchen floor, and that whispered prayer in the dark. The heaviness she'd been carrying for weeks felt like it had eased up, not gone, but lighter. As she stood by the window, watching the trees sway gently, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Mom. Emma turned and saw Ben standing in the doorway, dragging his worn-out blanket behind him. His blonde hair was sticking up in every direction, and his sleepy blue eyes blinked up at her. He climbed into the chair by the table, his little legs swinging back and forth. "You're up early today, Ben," Emma said, forcing a soft smile. He nodded but stayed quiet, fiddling with the corner of his plate like he was thinking hard about something. Finally, without looking up, he asked, "Mom, was Jesus ever scared?" Emma blinked. The question came out of nowhere. "Scared?" she repeated, lowering the spoon into her cup. Ben finally looked at her, his face serious in that way only kids can manage. "Yeah, I had a dream. I was in a boat, and it was raining a lot. I thought the boat was going to sink, but then Jesus showed up and told me not to be scared." He wasn't scared, even with the rain. Emma sat still, watching her little boy tear apart a piece of bread like it was the most normal thing in the world. But to Emma, it wasn't. That feeling, the same one she'd had the night before, crept back in, wrapping around her heart. It was like Ben's dream had opened a door to something she hadn't thought about in years. Emma got up, quietly, crossing the room to the bookshelf. Her fingers brushed against the spines until she found what she was looking for. The old Bible. Its edges were worn, the cover soft from years of use. She hadn't opened it in so long, but it felt familiar, like picking up an old conversation right where it left off. She flipped through the pages, slowly, carefully, until her eyes landed on a highlighted passage. Mark 4, verse 39. She read it softly, almost whispering. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down. and it was completely calm, her eyes drifted down to the next verse. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Emma leaned back on the couch, letting out a slow breath. She could almost feel the cold spray of water, hear the waves slamming against the sides of the boat, and sense the panic of the disciples. She was one of them, trying to hold everything together, rowing as hard as she could, and not realizing that Jesus had been sitting there the whole time. Emma closed the Bible and held it close to her chest. The storm outside hadn't passed, but somehow, something inside her was settling. Maybe peace wasn't about waiting for the waves to stop. Maybe peace was about trusting that Jesus was in the boat, even while the storm raged on. Emma walked back to the kitchen and sat down across from Ben, the warmth of the Bible still lingering in her hands. She watched him chew his toast, his little feet kicking the air beneath the table. "What is it, Mom?" Ben asked, his voice muffled by the food in his mouth. Emma smiled softly, running her hand gently through his messy hair. "Nothing, sweetheart. I think I just needed to hear that story again." Ben shrugged, completely unfazed, and went back to his breakfast as if nothing had happened. Emma turned to gaze out the window. The storm outside wasn't gone. Bills still sat unopened on the counter. Her hours at work were still cut. And the car, well, it still made that weird noise every time she started it. But something had shifted. The storm didn't feel so big anymore. Maybe the wind hadn't stopped blowing, but Emma realized she didn't have to fight it alone. As Ben happily hummed to himself, Emma whispered quietly under her breath, "Thank you for being in the boat with me." And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what the next day would bring. The days that followed didn't bring the solutions Emma had hoped for. The waves hadn't stopped crashing. The bills were still on the table. The car still groaned each time she turned the key. And the uncertainty at work hadn't changed. But something else did. On Monday, Emma stood in line at the grocery store. Her cart held fewer items than usual, just the essentials to get through the week. She avoided looking at the total as the cashier scanned each item. When the time came to pay, Emma slid her card, barely breathing. Approved. Emma blinked, frowning slightly as she checked her phone. A deposit she hadn't expected. It wasn't much, just a refund from something she barely remembered. But it was enough to cover the groceries. Emma left the store with more than just bags in her hands. She carried a feeling she hadn't felt in weeks. A quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. On Tuesday evening, as Emma was folding laundry, she heard a knock at the door. It was Margaret, her neighbor, standing there with a warm tray of lasagna wrapped in foil. "Emma, I made too much for dinner tonight. I thought you and the kids might enjoy some." Emma smiled, but tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "Margaret, thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." Margaret gave her a knowing look and nodded. "I had a feeling. Let me know if you need anything else." That night, as Emma served the lasagna, Ben grinned from ear to ear. "This is the best dinner ever." Emma laughed softly, brushing away a tear. It was just lasagna, but in that moment, it felt like a feast. On Wednesday, her phone rang again. It was her boss. Emma hesitated before answering, bracing herself for more bad news. "Emma, I know things have been tight, but I have a freelance project you can do from home. It's not much, but I thought it might help." Emma exhaled, relief flooding her chest. Yes, I'd love to take it. Thank you." The miracles weren't grand. There were no flashes of lightning or parting seas, but there were small, quiet moments like sunlight filtering through storm clouds. Each one felt like a whisper, gently reminding Emma, "I'm here. I haven't forgotten you." And as those small moments added up, Emma realized something. Maybe the storm hadn't ended, but grace was finding her in the middle of it. That evening, after tucking the kids into bed, Emma sat on the couch with a light blanket draped over her shoulders. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint sound of wind rustling outside. She held a warm cup of tea in her hands, but wasn't in any rush to drink it. Emma just sat there, watching the steam rise, letting the stillness settle around her like a fragile kind of peace. The bills were still on the table, the car still needed fixing, and work was still uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, Emma didn't feel like she was sinking. It was as if the tightness in her chest had loosened. Not because the problems were gone, but because the fear wasn't in control anymore. Her eyes wandered around the room. The old couch, the toys she hadn't had time to pick up, the curtains a little worn from the sunlight. The house wasn't perfect, but at that moment, it felt enough. Emma realized she didn't have to figure it all out at once. Faith wasn't about knowing the whole path. It was about taking the next step. The next day, as she washed the dishes, she noticed something small but different. It wasn't anything grand, just a sense that things were moving at a gentler pace. When Ben spilled juice all over the table, Emma didn't feel the usual knot in her stomach. She simply sighed, grabbed a cloth, and started cleaning it up. No tears, no frustration. When another bill arrived in the mail, she set it aside with the others. But this time, it didn't feel like the envelope was a threat. Emma started to see that the waves were still there, but they weren't pulling her under. Something inside her had shifted. That afternoon, Emma sat on the porch, wrapped in a light sweater, watching the kids play in the yard. The breeze was cool, and the sky was soft and pale, with just a few clouds drifting lazily by. As she watched Ben laugh and chase his sister around, Emma looked up at the sky and smiled. The storm was passing slowly, but it was, and Emma realized that the calm hadn't come all at once. It had arrived little by little, like the sun quietly rising after a long night. And even if the waves came back someday, Emma knew now she wouldn't row alone. The weeks passed, but something in Emma had changed. The problems didn't disappear, the car still needed fixing, and work hadn't gone back to normal. But somehow, Emma felt like she was standing on the water, not drowning in it. The biggest change wasn't what was happening around her. It was what had happened inside. Now, when things went wrong, and they still did, Emma didn't panic. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and kept moving forward. The difference? She knew without a doubt that she wasn't rowing alone anymore. One Saturday afternoon, Emma was folding laundry when she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Rachel, her neighbor and longtime friend. Rachel stepped inside, but there was no warm smile on her face like usual. Her shoulders looked heavy, and her eyes carried the same tiredness Emma had once seen in her own reflection. Emma poured fresh coffee and pulled out a chair for Rachel. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Rachel let out a long sigh, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup. "You know, some days I feel like I'm just trying to keep my head above water. No matter how hard I try, things keep going wrong." Emma listened quietly, letting Rachel pour her heart out. And as her friend spoke, Emma realized how far she had come. Not long ago, those words could have been her own. But now, Emma sat on the other side of the table, not because her life was perfect, but because she had learned how to face the storms. Rachel rubbed her eyes, trying to hold back tears. "I don't know how you handle all of this, Emma. If it were me, I think I would have fallen apart by now." Emma smiled softly, leaning forward a little. "Rachel, I did fall apart. More than once." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. "But you seem so calm now. What changed?" Emma placed her cup down and glanced out the window, where Ben was playing with his sister in the yard. "I realize the storm doesn't have to stop for me to feel peace," Emma said gently. "Sometimes God doesn't calm the sea right away. He starts by calming our hearts first." Rachel sat quietly, letting those words sink in. "But how do I get there? How do I find that peace?" Emma smiled warmly and reached across the table, gently holding Rachel's hand. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and so is God. He's already in the boat with you. Even if you can't see him yet, Rachel nodded, brushing away a tear that escaped. "Thank you, Emma. I needed to hear that." Emma squeezed her hand softly. "We'll get through this together, one wave at a time." In that moment, Emma realized that the storm she had faced wasn't just for her. Her pain had turned into compassion, and the journey that almost broke her had now become the bridge that would help someone else cross their own storm. A few weeks later, the sun was setting slowly behind the trees as Emma walked by the lake with Ben and his sister. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and gold, reflecting gently on the calm water. The air was cool, and a light breeze carried the distant sound of laughter from families nearby. Ben ran ahead, kicking small rocks along the path, while Emma watched quietly from behind. It felt like a simple moment, but Emma knew it meant more than that. The storm had passed, not because everything had been fixed, but because her heart felt calm, even though the waters outside were still moving. Ben suddenly stopped near the edge of the lake. He stood there, staring at the clouds reflected on the surface of the water, his little face full of thought. Emma walked up beside him, gently brushing his hair back. "What is it, Ben?" she asked, kneeling next to him. Ben didn't look away from the water. "Mom, remember that dream about the boat?" Emma smiled softly. "I remember. You said it was raining a lot." Ben nodded. "I wasn't scared anymore after that dream." Emma looked at him, curious. "Why not?" Ben grinned faintly, as if the answer was obvious. "Because Jesus was there. He's always there." Emma felt warmth bloom in her chest as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, he always is." She pulled Ben into a hug, holding him tightly as the golden light from the sunset wrapped around them. For a brief moment, time felt like it slowed down. The wind danced lightly over the lake, and as Emma looked out at the horizon, she felt a peace so steady it almost surprised her. The certainty she had longed for in the darkest moments was there, quiet but strong. As they continued walking along the path, Emma knew there would be more storms. Life would bring waves again, but this time she wasn't afraid. No matter how high the waves rose, the captain of the boat would remain the same. And even if the wind roared, he would be there, right beside her. Now, let me ask you, how long are you going to let life storms steal your peace? How often do you try to handle everything on your own without realizing that someone is already in the boat with you? Maybe the answer you've been searching for isn't in waiting for the storm to pass, but in trusting while the waves are still crashing. And you? Are you ready to let go of the fear and move forward with faith? If this story spoke to you, leave a comment below. What storm are you facing right now? I'd love to hear from you. Maybe this is the reminder you needed today that you're not alone. Oh, and don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories like this coming, and who knows? The next one might be exactly what you need to hear